All right, we're going to move on to our third area of review. In this section, we'll review the issues related to migration. The big ideas in migration, we'll talk about types of movement. We'll talk about the types of migration. We'll look again at Ravenstein's laws of migration, including the gravity model. We'll look at various push and pull factors, including political migrants, distance decay, again, a concept that we talked about earlier, intervening obstacles that impact migration. We'll look at migration flows. We'll look at the issues related to guest workers, and we'll look again at historic U.S. migration patterns. Types of movement to start. The first type of movement, if you remember when we first talked about this earlier in the year, cyclic movements. Shorter periods of time away from the home. This could be going to school, commuting, going to work, seasonal movements, also looking at other parts of the world, nomadism, going to a specific area where they know that there's grass for their livestock, for example. Periodic movements, longer periods away from the home. This could be going to college and back, as many of you will be doing next year. Migrant labor, if you're thinking about maybe migrant farm workers coming into the United States or other parts of the world, and then moving on once the agricultural product is picked. Again, my favorite, transhumance, taking your livestock up higher in the mountains or down to the valleys, looking for the green fields to feed your livestock. Military service, another example of periodic movement. You're stationed in one place for a period of time, then you might be transferred to another place. And then the next level up, migration, involves a greater degree of permanence. Could be internal migration, could be international migration, and we'll talk about both types. Types of migration, forced migration. Basically, it's an involuntary migrational movement. Usually involves the imposition of authority or power on the individual or individuals. Voluntary migration means that the migration or the migrant is looking at different reasons for migration and their choices, where they're going to go, what their motivation is to go. Oftentimes it's going to be economic. As we talked about in class, the distinction between forced migration and voluntary migration isn't always clear-cut. It's more of a continuum than it is something black and white, because you could look at, for example, economic conditions, and in some cases consider that to be a forced migration as opposed to a voluntary choice to look for economic opportunity elsewhere. Part of that blurring of the lines, if you will, European migration to the U.S. in the 19th and 20th centuries was voluntary. If you look at Irish migration, in some cases in the mid-1800s it might have been voluntary, but in some cases people might have felt they were forced to because of the harsh treatment by the British of the Irish people. Just remember again that you can make an argument one way or another, but it's not necessarily going to be black and white. It's more likely to be on a continuum. Okay, some examples that we talked about in class. The upper left-hand corner there you can see Indian removal under Andrew Jackson. On the right-hand side, the larger map, you can see the forced migration of Africans to work on plantations in mines and in the fields in the New World, in the Americas. And in the lower left, you've got several different types of movement. In the red, you've got military personnel moving toward Japan as part of the Pacific War and World War II. You do have in the green civilian movement, in some cases from like Hawaii, for example, which obviously was involved with Pearl Harbor, parts of Alaska into California in that same World War II time frame. But you've also got with the dots the Japanese internment camps. So you've got a forced migration of people. Again, all happening in the same relative time frame. All right, types of voluntary migration. These are all ones that we mentioned before. Step migration. So a series of shorter, less extreme migrations from a person's place of origin to a final destination. So they may go to an intermediate spot for a period of time and then move on from there. An intervening opportunity. Oftentimes they may plan on going to a place much further away, but something happens, a job comes up, an opportunity, a place to live that intervenes and encourages the migrant to settle in a place that may not be his final destination. Chain migration, again, pretty easy to remember because it's as if someone gets to a place and then they're pulling a chain with other people at the other end. So it begins with one family member who ends up in a place. They might be sending money back, remittances back to other family members, and then over time, as they can afford, having those family members join them in the new location. Ravenstein's laws of migration. Again, there are several laws of migration, but some of the ones that we want to remember. Every migrant generates a return or a counter migration. So every action has a reaction. Another way of saying that. Most migrants move a very short distance. For example, if you look at the maps where migrants have come up from Mexico and South America, many of them end up just beyond the border in the United States, partly because they find familiar aspects of their culture there, other groups that might be living in that area. They don't necessarily go further into the United States. But again, majority of migrants move a short distance. Migrants who move longer distances tend to end up in larger urban areas. That could, again, be because that might be where a factory job or other industry jobs are. It might also be where there's an enclave of those similar ethnicity. Urban residents are less migratory than inhabitants of rural areas. So people living in a city in other parts of the world are less likely to migrate. This is kind of part of the overall trend of a rural to urban migratory pattern. Families are less likely to make international moves than young adults, and most of those international migrants initially are going to be young men, and then eventually through chain migration it might be other members of the family. Push and pull factors. Why do people choose to migrate? There are three major types of push and pull factors. There are political factors, there are environmental factors, and very commonly economic factors for migration. Political factors, I'll give you a few examples here. Some you may be familiar with, some you may not. Fleeing an oppressive government. 1975, at the end of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, so after the U.S. pulled out and South Vietnam fell to the North Vietnamese, we forced to leave even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Many people who had been supportive of the U.S. in South Vietnam felt the conditions were such that they couldn't stay. So many people fled in boats and any way they could to get out of Vietnam. Many came to the United States. Many went to other places as well. But in fear of the communist takeover, since they'd supported the United States and the South Vietnamese government, they felt that they had to leave. So that's 1975. 1972, you may not be familiar with the dictator of Uganda, Idi Amin. He was brutal to his people. And at one point in August of 72, he ordered that all the Asian persons in Uganda leave, and he gave them just 90 days to leave. So they really had no choice but to do that. 1980, Fidel Castro, president of Cuba. What initially began, he was kind of forced by protest and something of a mass movement of people to allow voluntary migration from Cuba. So he, for a time anyway, kind of opened the gates and allowed them to leave on boats from Mariel Harbor. But toward the end of that period of time, I believe it was about 6 months, he also opened the asylums and opened the prisons and allowed a lot of those people to emigrate to the United States as well. So that's a combination. Well, actually, it probably is more voluntary migration, but certainly those that were fleeing Cuba were fleeing an oppressive government. And then, as I mentioned, Fidel Castro at the end of that time period kind of took advantage of it and stuck it to the United States to some extent. Another variation of political motivations, conflict and civil war. We talked about the breakup of Yugoslavia, Balkanization, if you will, 1990. You're probably familiar as well with the Hutus and the Tutsis and the Rwandan genocide in the mid-1990s. Certainly those that were able to get out of there would be considered political migrants. Cultures and traditions. Once India gains its independence from Great Britain and the partition of India and Pakistan, initially East Pakistan and West Pakistan, India primarily as a Hindu nation, Pakistan as a majority Muslim population. If you remember, whether you saw it in Gandhi or whether you'd read about it in other classes, there was a mass migration. So Muslims who lived in India generally migrated to Pakistan, and those who were Hindu in Pakistan migrated to India, and there was a lot of conflict because they were passing each other, and it was a very violent time as well. 1990s, we have Jews migrating from the Soviet Union to the West, to Israel and other places. In the mid-1990s, we have white South Afrikaners as apartheid begins to crumble. We have the movement of white South Africans fearing change and fearing the demise of apartheid in their country and moving to other locations. When we look at how the United Nations High Commission for Refugees looks at political migrants, there are three categories, and it's important to be able to distinguish between these three. First, we have the refugee, someone who's been forced to migrate, forced to leave to avoid a potential threat to his or her life, and they cannot return to that location for fear of persecution if they were forced to go back. Second category, IDPs, or internally displaced persons, very similar to a refugee, but this is someone who's migrated within the border of that country, so one who's not migrated across international borders. Third category is an asylum seeker, so someone who has migrated from one country to another country with the hopes of being recognized as a refugee. So you could consider a single person at different stages in the process. They could start off being internally displaced. They could leave their country as an asylum seeker and then be granted refugee status in a place that might be their destination. We talked a lot about the number of people in each of these categories, and I'll give you some time. You can pause the video to take a look at this chart. All right, environmental factors, 1840s, Irish migration, again, partly due to the oppressive policies that Great Britain imposed on the Irish, but you certainly have the potato famine. People were starving. They were looking, yes, for economic opportunity, but they were also looking to stay alive. So a forced migration, environmental forced migration in that sense. Other events that might happen, other crises that might happen, earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, flood, and drought could force people to leave the place of their origin. Oftentimes makes it difficult, if not impossible, for them to return to their homeland. All right, economic migration, for the most part, looking for better job opportunities, looking for more opportunity, fleeing poverty, fleeing really a lack of an opportunity to get ahead. The U.S. and Canada have been significant destinations for economic migrations in recent decades. Most recently, Latin America and Asia are the primary origin points for those migrants who are migrating for primarily economic regions or economic reasons. All right, we talked about this in earlier units, but it's important to emphasize, again, distance decay. It comes into play with pull factors of migration. Migrants are more likely to have a complete perception of places that are closer to where they are, where they initiate from, than farther ones. So, for example, think about a Mexican migrant just across the border in the United States, certainly can enjoy maybe some of the benefits of the United States government, but still have many aspects of their culture existent there, where if they move to Minnesota, it's going to be very different. There's going to be quite a significant level of decay traveling that further distance up to the northern states in the United States. Again, this leads to many migrants ending up in a location that is closer to where they left than they might have originally contemplated. Intervening obstacles. This can be any number of things. This is something that intervenes that hinders their migration, that hinders their progress from what is their ultimate destination. Historically, these have been environmental obstacles. Could be a huge mountain, could be an ocean, could just be that the destination is so far away. In modern times, increasingly intervening obstacles might be political in nature, so certain documentation that's required to enter a country, a visa, or even required to leave a country. But both types, ones that you should consider. Global migration flows between 1500, so just after the discovery of the New World, or the rediscovery of the New World by Columbus, up to 1950. Major global migration was influenced by exploration, and certainly in the early part of that period. Colonization, and that goes to 1950 because many of the colonies didn't gain their independence until after World War II. And also to the Atlantic slave trade. I like this chart, and I encourage you to spend just a little bit of time going through, looking at number 1, looking at number 2, and thinking about the time periods that drove each of these global migration patterns. You could very well see a world map, see an area, or see an arrow that links one region to another region, and be asked to describe what is presented. Certainly several different types of migration that you see here. You may remember this diagram. I do like this diagram. You got to spend some time to figure it out, but you can see locations from which people emigrate to their destinations, to where they're immigrating. They pack a lot into this diagram. A regional migration flow, so inter-regional or intra-regional even. Migrants going to neighboring countries, so short-term economic opportunities. It could be for a period of time, then they come back. Reconnect with cultural groups across the borders. Again, a great example is Mexico and the southern United States, the Southwest. Could also be to flee political conflict. If you think about migrants from Central America, where either there is criminality or there is political unrest. Economic opportunities, so islands of development, and there's an illustration of that on both of these maps off here to the right. So a place or a region within a country, or I'm sorry, a place within a region or a country where there might be foreign investment by developed countries, where there are jobs, where there's infrastructure, where people might be drawn, pull factors into those territories. And there are several here on the continent of Africa. There are several opportunities that we saw in Southeast Asia in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So working in trade, working in commerce, and then in more recent times, working in finance in South Asia. So again, immigrants from China going to other areas in Southeast Asia for opportunity, and again in Africa, the draw of foreign investment that provides jobs in different parts of the continent. Reconnecting with cultural groups, and a great example of that between 1900 and 1948, you've got a significant Jewish migration to what was then known as Palestine, after 1948 known as Israel. Jews from Europe, Jews from the United States and elsewhere, migrating to what was then Palestine, what becomes Israel. We also see, in some ways, the forced migration of the Palestinian Arabs who had been living there And as a result of conflict caused by those nations around Israel, the Palestinians were pushed out of their homelands, and many of them remain in Israeli-controlled territories, the Palestinian territories. National migration flows, we've talked about it also as internal migration in the United States. And again, we're familiar with this because we studied this in a couple different classes. In the early 20th century, we have the two great migrations, and the map there illustrates the first great migration, African Americans in the South during the Depression, during World War I, and as World War II gears up as well, looking for jobs in the North, and in some cases looking for jobs on the West Coast, factory jobs primarily. We also see internal migration, and this is mostly post-World War II, into the Sun Belt, so southern states. Part of that is the fact that many factories in the South were non-union factories, but also the advent of air conditioning and the highway system that and irrigation for that matter, that made living in those desert type environments much more attractive. In China, we have significant internal migration. We've had this massive movement from the countryside into the cities, and we've looked a little bit at what the impact of that is. Guest workers. So a guest worker is a migrant that is allowed to be in a country to fill a certain niche, a certain job that needs to be filled. The assumption with a guest worker is they've got this pass to come in and do a job. Eventually they'll go home when there is no longer a need for that labor. Oftentimes this is for agricultural, but it could be for other types of labor as well. So short-term work visas that allow them to be in the country on the assumption that they'll go home when the work is finished. It could be seasonal, though, because it could be an annual harvest, something like that. And oftentimes they'll send remittances back home. So again, sometimes when a worker in, for example, the United States sends money back to the family in a less developed country, those remittances make up a significant portion of the GDP of those less developed countries. Right, U.S. immigration patterns. The U.S. has more foreign-born residents than any other country. So since as of 2010, and we looked at it a little bit more recently earlier in the year, but as of 2010, 43 million of us in the United States were foreign-born. Three main eras of settlement, and certainly you can break these down even further, but you've got the colonial era in the 17th and 18th century. You've got significant European immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then in the 20th and the early parts of the 21st century, a lot of it's been from Asia and also from Latin America. Again, you may remember these charts here tracking number of immigrants and how it's changed from the 1800s through the early 2000s. Foreign-born population as a percentage of total population. You can see how it changes as we go through the years. All right, so that wraps up migration.